Prologue. The smile that shouldn't exist. They say every village has its secret, but ours had a curse that wore a smile. I was a child the first time I noticed it. The church was heavy with incense and grief. A man had died suddenly, and the entire town gathered in silence. Candles flickered against the stained glass windows, shadows stretching like black fingers across the pews. Everyone wept, everyone prayed, everyone mourned. Everyone except him. Father Gabriel stood at the altar, dressed in his immaculate black cassock, his eyes downcast as if in prayer. But on his lips was something that froze me to the marrow. A smile. Not of comfort, not of mercy. It was the kind of smile that made the air colder, that made even the dead seem restless. At first I thought I was imagining it. Perhaps I was too young, too frightened. But then the whispering began. The widows whispered. The children whispered. The gravediggers whispered, because they had seen it too. The priest smiled during funerals, always. No one dared confront him. Who could accuse a man of God of such blasphemy? And yet questions burned in every heart. Why did he smile when coffins were lowered? Why did his lips curl when mothers screamed over their children's graves? Why, when the bells tolled for the dead, did his face brighten as if he alone was celebrating? Some said it was his way of showing faith, smiling at death, mocking despair with hope. Others said it was madness, the fracture of a soul too long immersed in death. But there were darker whispers, ones uttered only in candlelit kitchens, behind locked doors, that his smile was not of God at all, that it was an invitation, that every grin was a bargain sealed with the dirt of a fresh grave. I remember one night, when the wind rattled the church windows, I swore I heard laughter echoing through the empty nave. Not the laughter of a man, but something hollow, something carried from beneath the ground. And when I ran past the cemetery, I saw faces in the soil, faces twisted into that same unbearable grin. Years passed and Father Gabriel never changed. He never aged. Funeral after funeral, coffin after coffin, his smile widened as if feeding on sorrow. It became a sickness in our town. Death no longer felt like mourning. It felt like entertainment, and he was always there. The silent witness, smiling. Now, as I write this, the bells toll again. Another funeral is beginning. Another soul will be buried under his watch. And though I should not, though my hands tremble as I confess this, I have begun to fear that one day, it will be my own coffin that lowers under the weight of his smile. Because here, in this village, the dead do not rest, and the priest never stops smiling. Chapter 1. The smile no one forgot. The first time he smiled, I thought it was a trick of the light. It was the funeral of old Marta, the baker's wife. The church was suffocating with sorrow. Her children knelt in the front row, sobbing into their hands while the choir's hymn rose like a broken cry through the nave. I remember the smell of melted wax, the heavy incense clouding the air, and the echo of every cough, every breath, every tear. And then, through the haze, I saw him, Father Gabriel, his hands folded over the Bible, his voice steady as stone, his words of eternal rest carried to heaven. But his lips betrayed him. They curved upward, slow, deliberate. It was not a fleeting smile of kindness. It was a smile that lingered, as though he knew something the rest of us could not bear to understand. The congregation noticed. I could feel it ripple through the pews like a shudder of cold wind. A widow behind me gasped softly. A child clutched his mother's arm and whispered, "Why is he happy?" But no one spoke aloud. No one dared. When the coffin was lowered into the ground that evening, his smile widened, and I swear to you, I heard something shift in the earth. A sound like wood creaking or perhaps fingers clawing against the lid of the casket. That night the whispers began. "He smiled again," someone murmured at the tavern. "He smiled like death was a friend." Others said his teeth gleamed too white, too sharp when candlelight touched them. But the bravest of them all, the gravedigger, swore he heard laughter echoing from the soil as he covered Marta's grave. From then on, the funerals became spectacles. Every time the church bells tolled, people came not only to mourn, but to watch him, to see if the stories were true. And without fail, he did not disappoint. Young or old, rich or poor, it didn't matter whose body lay in the coffin. He smiled. And yet, no one could accuse him. For when the ceremony ended, when the villagers lined up to kiss his hand, his eyes were gentle, his blessings soft. He was the shepherd, the holy man, the bridge between earth and heaven. Who among us would dare call him a monster? But I will never forget the funeral of the child, a little boy, barely 7. As the coffin was carried down the aisle, so small it looked more like a wooden box than a vessel of death, the entire village wept. Mothers collapsed in grief. Fathers clenched their fists at the cruelty of God. And there, in the midst of agony, Father Gabriel's smile bloomed wider than I had ever seen. It was not the smile of faith, it was the smile of hunger. And that, I think, was the moment we all understood. This was not a man who comforted the dead. This was a man who fed on them. Chapter 2. The Widow's Curse. It was after Marta's burial that the first curse was spoken. Her husband Tomas was not a man of faith. He had baked bread with her for 40 years. But never once did he kneel in church except on holy days. Yet on the night after her funeral, he came stumbling into the square, his face pale as flour, his hands trembling like broken branches. "I heard her," he whispered to anyone who would listen. "I heard Marta knocking." The villagers dismissed him at first. Grief can do strange things to a man. But Tomas's voice carried the desperation of one who had heard more than memory. "3 knocks," he insisted, "from beneath the earth. And after each one, I heard him laughing." The tavern went silent. Everyone knew who him meant. The next day, Tomas went to the church, stormed up the aisle during morning prayers, and pointed his shaking finger at Father Gabriel. His voice cracked against the stone walls. "You smiled when she died. You smiled, and now she will not rest. Give her peace, or I will curse you myself." Gasps erupted from the pews. To accuse a priest before the altar, before God, was unthinkable. But Gabriel did not flinch. He simply closed the Bible, raised his eyes, and smiled. Not at Tomas, not at the crowd. He smiled at the crucifix above the altar, as though sharing a private joke with the dying Christ. Tomas spat on the floor. "Then may the earth reject you, priest. May no grave hold you when your time comes." His words echoed like a hammer striking stone. Then he fled, wild-eyed, vanishing into the fog that crept along the cemetery. That night, the curse took root. The bell tower rang 13 times at midnight, though no hand touched the rope. Dogs howled until their voices broke. And in the graveyard, Marta's tomb cracked. Not enough to spill, but enough to bleed the scent of freshly turned soil into the wind. By morning, Tomas was found dead, face down in his bakery, his mouth frozen open as though in mid-scream. His eyes stared upward, glassy, reflecting something none of us could see. And on his lips, God help me, was the faintest trace of a smile. At his funeral, the villagers waited, breath held, to see if the priest would do it again. And of course he did. Standing over the body of the man who cursed him, Father Gabriel's grin stretched so wide it seemed almost inhuman. Some swore his teeth were too many that day. Others claimed his tongue flickered like a serpent's. I only know that I felt Marta's presence, heavy and restless, hovering just beyond the graveyard gates. The curse had been spoken, the ground had cracked, and from that day forward, every funeral carried not only sorrow, but the dread that we were all standing in a theater of his making. And Father Gabriel, he smiled as if he had just won. Chapter 3. The Child's Funeral. The smallest coffin I had ever seen was carried through the church doors on a rain-soaked morning. 7 years old. That was all the boy had lived. His name was Elias, a child with hair like golden wheat and eyes too curious for this world. He had drowned in the river while chasing after a toy boat, and when the villagers pulled him out, his lips were blue. His tiny fingers clenched as if he had been reaching for something unseen. The church was suffocating that day. Mothers pressed their children closer, as though holding them tighter might keep death away. Fathers bowed their heads, ashamed of their tears. And in the midst of it all stood Father Gabriel, the black folds of his cassock unmoving, his hands resting on the coffin as though blessing it. But then it happened, that smile. I had seen it before, but never like this. As Elias's mother screamed and collapsed against the coffin, Father Gabriel's lips parted wider than ever. His teeth shone in the candlelight, his eyes glittered with a hunger I could not name. It was not compassion, it was not faith. It was delight. The whispers rose instantly. Some gasped. Others turned away, unable to look. A brave man in the back shouted, "Monster!" but his voice was swallowed by the hymn the choir continued to sing, their voices trembling as though they too feared what stood at the altar. When the pallbearers lowered the coffin into the ground, the rain stopped. A silence fell over the cemetery, thick and unnatural. Then came a sound, 3 sharp knocks, from within the coffin itself. Mothers shrieked, children cried, the earth quaked beneath our feet, and Father Gabriel laughed. Not loud, not wild, but soft. A chuckle, almost hidden, carried on the wind like the echo of a secret. That night, Elias's mother swore she heard her son's voice calling from the grave. "Mama," he whispered through the cracks of her window. He smiled at me. She woke the neighbors with her screams, but when they rushed into her home, the only thing they found was a trail of wet footprints leading to her bed. By morning, she was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets soaked as though she had drowned where she slept. At the Sunday Mass that followed, Father Gabriel spoke of eternal life, of hope, of heaven's embrace. But while his words were holy, his smile told another story. A story of a shepherd not guiding souls upward, but binding them to something far darker, far hungrier. The villagers began to avoid his gaze. They lowered their eyes when he walked past, pressed their lips shut when he offered blessings. But it did not matter. He had already seen them. He had already smiled. And if the whispers were true, once he smiled at you, your soul was no longer your own. Chapter 4. The Diary of the Dead. It was Sister Helena who found the book. She had been cleaning the sacristy late at night, dusting shelves no one had touched for decades, when her hand brushed against a loose stone in the wall. Behind it lay a small leather-bound diary, its cover cracked, its pages stained as though it had been hidden from both light and God. She should have burned it. She should have cast it into the fire before a single word was read. But curiosity, as it always does, opened the door to ruin. The diary belonged to a priest, not Father Gabriel, at least not by name. The dates etched within its pages were older than the town itself, entries spanning back nearly 2 centuries. Each page detailed funerals, names, dates, causes of death. But what chilled Sister Helena was not the record-keeping, but the repetition. At the bottom of every entry, written in the same curling script, were the words, "I smiled, and he came closer." The handwriting changed over time. Different strokes, different ink, but always the same sentence, as though generations of priests had shared one single truth passed down like a curse. Helena brought the book to me in secret. She was pale, trembling, her voice quivering as she whispered, "He is not the first." I read the entries myself, my fingers numb as I turned the pages. Children, mothers, soldiers, strangers, all buried under watchful eyes and that same forbidden smile. One entry struck deeper than the rest. Dated 1831, it read, "The boy cried when the coffin closed. I smiled, and his voice followed me into the earth. He still speaks at night, but only when I smile back." I slammed the book shut, my stomach twisting. This was no ritual of comfort. This was an invocation. The smile was not his own. It was a signal, a beacon, a doorway. The more I read, the more a truth became unbearable. Father Gabriel was not unique. He was part of a line, a bloodline perhaps, or something darker, something older than names and flesh. Each priest who bore the smile carried the same power, the same burden, the same hunger. That night Helena begged me to help her burn the diary. "If he learns we have it," she whispered, "he will make us part of his record." But before we could act, the church bells rang. Midnight. And though no hand touched the rope, the sound was deafening. We rushed to the sacristy where we had left the book. The stone wall was sealed, the diary gone. And there in the doorway stood Father Gabriel. He said nothing. He only looked at us and smiled. It was then I understood. The diary was never meant to be found by us. It was meant to be returned to him. And now we too had become part of his history. Chapter 5. The Coffin That Wouldn't Stay Shut. It happened during the funeral of Ignacio, the blacksmith. He had been a giant of a man, his arms like iron, his voice booming across the village square. When he fell dead at his forge, his heart stopping in the middle of a hammer's swing, the shock spread like wildfire. The whole town came to bury him. And once more Father Gabriel stood ready at the altar, lips curved in that eternal, unholy smile. The service began like all the others. The hymns rose, candles flickered, incense choked the air. Ignacio's coffin rested at the center, its wood groaning under the weight of grief. I sat in the back, but I could not take my eyes off the priest. He watched the coffin with a hunger barely concealed, as though he were waiting for something. And then, as the final prayers were spoken, the coffin shook. At first it was subtle, a faint rattle, like wood shifting against nails. The mourners stirred uneasily. Some gasped, others whispered prayers. But the shaking grew stronger, violent, as though something inside was desperate to get out. A scream tore through the church when the lid cracked open. The pallbearers leapt back, and from within, Ignacio's body sat up. His skin was pale, his lips blue, his eyes lifeless. But on his face, there it was, the same smile, the same curve of lips that mirrored Father Gabriel's perfectly. Women fainted, men dragged their children away, and still the corpse smiled, as if mocking us, as if celebrating its own resurrection. Father Gabriel did not move. He did not speak. He only raised a hand, and for a moment, it looked as though the dead man bowed to him, like a servant recognizing his master. Then, with a shudder, Ignacio's body collapsed back into the coffin, his jaw snapping shut so hard it echoed like thunder through the nave. The lid fell closed. The church went silent. When the pallbearers, pale as death themselves, tried to nail the coffin shut again, the nails would not hold. Every time the hammer struck, the lid split back open, as though the wood itself refused to bind him. Finally, Father Gabriel approached. He laid his pale hand upon the coffin, leaned close, and whispered words none of us could hear. Only then did the wood still. Only then did the nails bite deep and remain fastened. The people wanted answers, but none dared ask. For as he turned back to us, Father Gabriel's smile widened, stretching too far, too sharp, too knowing. That night, rumors spread like fire. Some said Ignacio still walked the cemetery, hammer in hand, his smile glowing under the moonlight. Others swore they heard the blacksmith's forge roaring at midnight, though no flame was lit. But I know what I saw. The dead rose for him. The coffin would not close for him. And with every grave that failed to hold its body, his power grew. Chapter 6. The bells that rang at midnight. The church bell was meant to toll only for the dead. One slow, solemn ring for each soul, a ritual as old as our village itself. But what happened that night was no ritual, it was a warning. It was just past midnight when the first strike echoed across the valley. I woke instantly, the sound vibrating through my bones. It was not the hollow, mournful call I had heard all my life. This was sharp, violent, like the bell was being torn apart with every swing. One strike, then another, then another. 13 times it rang. Though no funeral had been announced, no body had been lost that day. By the final toll, the entire village was awake. Windows lit up, doors creaked open, and neighbors stood barefoot in the dirt roads, staring up at the tower that loomed black against the moon. But no one was inside the church. We knew that because we saw him, Father Gabriel. He stood at the cemetery gate, perfectly still, his pale hands folded, his head tilted back as though savoring the sound. And on his lips was that cursed smile, glowing in the candlelight flickering from the graves. Suddenly the ground shifted. At first a tremor. Then came the sound, hundreds of fists pounding from beneath the earth, muffled, frantic. Every grave in the cemetery seemed alive. The earth pulsed, cracked, as though the dead were begging to be released. The villagers screamed, some fleeing back into their homes, others frozen in terror. But Father Gabriel never moved. He simply raised his hand, and with that gesture the bell stopped mid-swing. Silence fell, crushing and absolute. Then came the whispers. They slithered through the night like wind in the grass, voices too many to count. Some were sobbing, some were laughing, and some called names, our names, mine among them. The voices of the dead crying out from their coffins, repeating the only truth they had left. He smiled at us. A child collapsed to the ground, shrieking that her grandmother's face was staring at her from the soil. A man clawed at his ears, insisting his dead brother was whispering secrets of fire and blood. But Father Gabriel only watched. He looked at us, at the chaos, the terror, the broken faith spilling across his flock. And then, When we could bear no more, he smiled wider, his teeth glowing in the pale moonlight. By dawn, the bell tower was cracked. Its ropes were torn as though wrenched by unseen hands. And in the cemetery, fresh soil had risen from several graves, though none dared dig to see what waited beneath. From that night on, no one trusted the bell, because when it rang at midnight, it did not mourn the dead, it awakened them. And always, always, Father Gabriel was there to listen. Chapter 7. The Confession That Wasn't Heard. The confessional is supposed to be a place of mercy, a dark wooden box where sins are whispered, forgiven, and sealed away by God Himself. But that night, it became something else, something I wish I had never heard. Matteo was the one who entered first, a young man, barely 20, his hands still calloused from the fields, his eyes carrying the weight of shame. He knelt inside, crossed himself, and waited for the voice of absolution. But instead of the usual gentle tone, he was met with silence, long, suffocating silence. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," Matteo began, his voice breaking. "I took what wasn't mine. I lied. I hurt someone I loved." His words tumbled out, desperate, trembling. He waited for penance, for the comfort of holy words. Still silence. Matteo pressed his forehead against the screen, tears streaking his cheeks. "Please," he begged, "say something." And then, through the darkness, it came. Not words, not prayer. A chuckle, low, hollow, inhuman. Matteo froze, his breath hitched. "Father?" he whispered. The chuckle grew louder, curling into a laugh that slithered between the wooden walls. And finally a whisper. "I hear you, but he does not." Matteo bolted from this confessional, his face as pale as bone. He stumbled into the church aisle, clutching his chest. People rushed to him, but he shoved them away, muttering, "He laughed at me. He laughed." That night, Matteo was found hanging from the rafters of his barn, a twisted smile carved unnaturally across his face. After his death, the rumors spread like wildfire. The confessional was no longer a sanctuary. Some said that if you confessed to Father Gabriel, you would not be forgiven, you would be claimed. I could not stay away. My curiosity, my terror, drove me to the box a week later. I knelt, trembling, heart pounding against the wood. The air inside was heavy, damp, as though the wood itself was rotting from secrets it could no longer contain. "Forgive me, Father," I whispered, But I stopped, because on the other side I heard nothing human, not silence this time, breathing, slow, steady, unnatural, and then the faintest sound of teeth grinding together in a grotesque rhythm. I ran before he could speak, before the laugh could return. But I knew, deep in my soul, I knew. The confessional was no longer for the living. It was a door, and Father Gabriel was not hearing our sins. He was feeding them to something else. And every confession only made his smile grow sharper. Chapter 8. The Funeral with No Body. It was the strangest funeral our village had ever seen, because there was no body. The coffin stood at the center of the church, draped in black cloth, surrounded by candles whose flames bent as though resisting the air itself. People gathered, whispering, eyes darting nervously toward the empty box. No one dared to ask who it belonged to. Father Gabriel did not explain. He only stood before us, hands clasped, his eternal smile cutting through the incense smoke like a wound. His voice was steady as he spoke prayers over the vacant coffin, each word heavier than the last. Whispers spread through the pews. Whose funeral is this? Why no name? Why no corpse? Mothers hushed their children. Men shuffled in unease. Yet no one left. It was as if something unseen held us there, binding us to witness. When the time came for the coffin to be carried out, the pallbearers hesitated. The wood was light, too light, weightless almost. But as they lifted it, a sound leaked from within. Not the creak of wood, not the groan of nails. A sigh, long, hollow, human. Gasps filled the church. One of the pallbearers dropped his end, swearing he felt fingers pressing against the lid from inside. But when the coffin thudded to the floor, it made no sound at all, as if it were empty. Father Gabriel simply raised his hand, silencing the panic. "The soul does not always need flesh," he said softly. "The earth will take what it requires." And then he smiled wider than ever. At the graveside, the coffin was lowered into the dirt. Still no name, no marker, just wood, soil, and silence. But as the first shovelfuls of earth struck the lid, a voice rose, faint, muffled, pleading, "Let me out!" The villagers screamed, some fled, others fell to their knees in terror. But Father Gabriel did not move. He watched as the dirt consumed the coffin, his smile gleaming under the moonlight. That night, people whispered of vanishings. A seamstress never returned home. A farmer's bed was found empty, his boots by the door. By dawn, 5 villagers were gone, their homes abandoned, their lives erased. And in the cemetery, fresh soil lay unsettled above the nameless grave. The truth clawed its way into our hearts. The funeral had not been for the dead, it had been for the living. Someone among us, maybe many, had been claimed, bound inside that coffin of nothing. And Father Gabriel's smile that night was not just satisfaction, it was a promise. From then on, when the bells tolled, we no longer asked who had died. We asked instead, who would disappear? Chapter 9. The Painting of the Priest. It was hidden in the monastery's attic behind a wall of dust and cobwebs. Brother Alonso had been tasked with clearing the space, but when he pulled aside a rotting canvas, he uncovered something no one had seen for generations. A painting. Large, framed in cracked gold leaf, its surface darkened with age. He thought it was simply another saintly relic, until the dust fell away. The figure in the portrait was unmistakable. A priest, dressed in black, hands folded over a Bible, standing before a graveyard. His eyes were cold, his posture rigid. But what struck Alonso, what made him stumble back with a gasp, was the smile. It was the same smile Father Gabriel wore. The plaque beneath bore the date, 1824, nearly 200 years ago. The villagers crowded into the attic that evening, drawn by whispers of the discovery. Some crossed themselves, others muttered curses. The likeness was too perfect, too precise. It wasn't just resemblance, it was identity. The same jawline, the same piercing eyes, the same smile that froze every heart. "How can this be?" a woman whispered. "He hasn't aged a day." The elders recalled stories passed down like broken prayers. A priest who came centuries ago, who smiled at every funeral, who never grew old. He vanished after a storm swallowed half the village in fire and flood. They thought he had perished with it. But now, staring at the canvas, we knew the truth. He hadn't died. He had simply returned. That night, the painting was brought to the church, locked in the sacristy. But when the dawn came, it was gone. In its place lay another canvas, fresh, the oils still wet. The same graveyard, the same figure in black. But this time, the coffin in the painting was open, and inside it, painted with terrifying precision, was the face of Brother Alonso. By evening, Alonso was dead, found in the bell tower, his body twisted, his lips frozen in that cursed smile. The villagers begged Father Gabriel for answers. He stood before us, hands raised in mock blessing, his grin sharper than ever. "Art," he said softly, "has a way of revealing what words cannot." That night, no one slept. Every shadow seemed to hold painted eyes. Some swore their reflections in the window panes were not their own, but brushstrokes waiting to dry. And deep in my chest I felt it. The painting was not just a relic, it was a mirror, a record, a curse that traveled with him across centuries. And if the whispers are true, every smile he gave was another portrait being painted, somewhere beyond our sight, of the next soul he would claim. Chapter 10. The Nun Who Tried to Stop Him. Not everyone remained silent under Father Gabriel's rain of smiles. Among us was Sister Magdalena, a woman of fierce devotion and sharper courage. She was not like the other nuns, who lowered their eyes and whispered prayers when his presence chilled the air. No, she looked straight into the storm and dared it to break. I remember the night she stood before the congregation, her voice rising against the vaulted ceiling. "This is not God's servant," she cried, her hands trembling over the rosary clutched to her chest. "This is a wolf in cassock, feeding on our dead. Can you not see? Every smile is a wound carved into our souls." Gasps echoed through the pews. Some wept in fear, others begged her to stop. But she did not. She turned, and with a hand that shook yet never faltered, pointed at Father Gabriel. He stood in the shadows near the altar, silent, his face aglow with that same dreadful grin. He did not deny her words. He did not defend himself. He only smiled wider, as if her defiance pleased him. Magdalena gathered her strength. That night, armed with holy water, salt, and a crucifix so old its edges had worn smooth, she entered the cemetery alone. I followed at a distance, too cowardly to join her, too terrified to abandon her. She knelt before the nameless grave, the coffin with no body, and drove the crucifix into the soil. Her prayers cut through the night like a blade. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, I banish what should not dwell among the living. For a moment the earth trembled, the air split with a scream that came not from one throat but from hundreds, all crying in agony, and then silence. Magdalena turned, sweat soaking her veil, her breath ragged. "It is done," she whispered. But it was not. From the fog he appeared. Father Gabriel. His eyes glowed with an unholy light, his cassock fluttering though the wind was still. He stepped toward her, each footfall heavier than the last, and stopped before the crucifix buried in the dirt. With one hand, he pulled it free. The wood cracked in his grip, splintering like kindling. And then, in a voice softer than a whisper yet louder than the bell tower, he said, "You cannot banish what was never invited." Magdalena screamed as the shadows swallowed her. I saw her veil torn away, her rosary scattering into the grass. Then she was gone, no body, no trace. Only the echo of her prayers hanging in the mist. The next morning her habit was found draped over the altar, soaked in blood that was not her own. And Father Gabriel led the Mass with a smile so wide it split his face like a wound. That day we learned a truth more terrifying than death itself. Not even faith could stand against him. Chapter 11. The Funeral of the Living. It began with a name written on the church notice board. Every Sunday, Father Gabriel posted the week's rites, baptisms, weddings, funerals. The villagers gathered after Mass to read them, a ritual as ordinary as the ringing of bells. But that morning, the board bore only one name, written in black ink that bled like fresh blood: Isabel Morales. The problem was, Isabel was alive. She was a seamstress, barely 25, known for her laughter that echoed brighter than the bells themselves. When she saw her own name, she laughed nervously, but her hands shook as she tried to scrub it away. The ink would not fade. The wood seemed to drink it deeper with every stroke. By evening, the entire town whispered, "Father Gabriel has announced a funeral for someone who still breathes." The next day, the church filled as though death had already claimed her. Isabel sat in the front pew, pale, trembling, clutching her rosary so tightly her knuckles bled. She begged the priest to tell her it was a mistake. He said nothing. He only smiled. The coffin stood ready at the altar, empty, waiting. The hymns began. The air thickened. Candles burned low, dripping faster than wax should fall. Isabel wept, shaking her head, whispering, "I am not dead. I am not dead." But when the pallbearers approached her, their eyes glassy, their movements stiff as puppets, we understood the ritual was already in motion. They lifted her struggling body and carried her to the coffin. The screams that tore from her throat were the kind that peel skin from bone. She kicked, clawed, begged, but the wood swallowed her whole. The lid slammed shut. Silence. Then came 3 muffled knocks. Gasps spread through the pews. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. Men held their wives close. But Father Gabriel raised his hand for silence, his grin cutting deeper into the air. "Let the earth receive what is hers," he intoned, his voice both prayer and curse. The coffin was lowered into the ground that same evening. I swear I saw the soil moving long after the last shovel struck, as though she were still fighting, still alive. By morning her shop was empty, dresses half sewn, needles left in fabric as if she had been torn away mid-stitch. No trace of Isabel Morales remained, except for the faint sound of her laughter that haunted the streets at night. And from that day forward, funerals were no longer only for the dead. Anyone could see their name written on the board. Anyone could hear their coffin nails hammered while their hearts still beat. The living were now prey. And Father Gabriel smiled, as though he had always known this day would come. Chapter 12. The day he smiled at himself. The day came when the church doors opened to a funeral unlike any we had ever seen. There was no grieving family, no choir, no procession of mourners. Only Father Gabriel himself, standing before the altar, with a coffin placed at the center. Its wood was darker than any I had seen, polished to a shine that reflected candle flames like blood. On the notice board outside, a single name had been written in black ink: Father Gabriel. At first we thought it was a trick, some cruel parody meant to terrify us further. But when the bells tolled, every villager was drawn into the church as though summoned. None dared stay away. Curiosity, dread, and something stronger, something we could not resist, pulled us through the doors. He stood there in silence, smiling at his own coffin. His hands moved with ritualistic calm as he sprinkled holy water over it, whispering words that none of us could hear. His lips curved wider with every drop that fell. Then, to our horror, he climbed inside. The sight of him lowering himself into the box, cassock folding like a shadow, made my stomach twist. He lay down, folded his hands across his chest, and closed his eyes. For a moment the world seemed to still. The air was thick, unbreathable. The candles dimmed. The lid shut on its own. We expected silence. We expected finality. Instead, the coffin shook violently. Knocks thundered from inside. First 3, then 5, then countless, like an army of fists. The church floor trembled. The crucifix above the altar rattled against the wall. And then, laughter. It came from within the coffin, but it was not alone. A chorus of voices joined it. Male, female, young, old. Every soul buried in that graveyard, every name whispered into the soil, laughed in unison. Their joy was agony, their mirth was terror. The lid burst open. The coffin was empty. Gasps erupted. Some screamed, but then a sound behind us made every heart stop. There he was, Father Gabriel, standing at the back of the church, his cassock untouched, his face pale as ever. And he was smiling at himself. Because at the altar, another Gabriel still lay in the coffin, eyes closed, hands folded, lips curved in that eternal grin. 2 of them, one alive, one dead, or perhaps neither. No one spoke, no one moved. The 2 Gabriels turned their heads at the same time, their eyes snapping open, glowing faintly in the candlelight. And then both smiled at us, perfectly mirrored, perfectly inhuman. That night, the village bells rang 13 times, though no one touched the rope. And in the graveyard, fresh soil stirred, as though making room for more. For the first time I realized the truth. Father Gabriel was not merely a man, he was a ritual, a cycle, a curse that could smile itself back into existence, and no coffin would ever hold him. Chapter 13. The Sin Beneath the Smile. By then, fear had become a second skin in our village. No one slept deeply, no one trusted the silence of night. But the worst was yet to be revealed, because behind Father Gabriel's endless grin hid a truth blacker than the soil of our graveyard. It was Sister Helena who uncovered it. She had not forgotten the diary we once found, the book that vanished into his hands. In secret, she began searching the church archives, combing through records older than our bloodlines, and one night, she summoned me to the crypt beneath the altar, her lantern shaking in her hand. "Read this," she whispered, thrusting a brittle manuscript into my arms. The text was older than parchment should survive, its ink smudged with time, its words written in Latin that bled like a curse. With trembling lips, Helena translated, "The smile is the seal. He who smiles at death feeds the mouth beneath the earth. Each grin binds a soul, not to heaven, but to the hollow." I felt bile rise in my throat. The hollow, the mouth beneath the earth. This was no metaphor. It was something alive, something that fed. And Gabriel was not its servant, he was its face. Helena's voice cracked as she read further. "One priest chosen for each century, bearing the eternal grin. To smile at funerals is to mark the dead. To laugh is to consume the living. And when the coffin closes, the mouth opens." I dropped the manuscript, my hands trembling. Everything made sense. The knocks from below, the laughter in the confessional, the empty funerals. The smile was not his at all. It belonged to the hunger he carried, a pact sealed long before our time. Helena grabbed my arm. "If he smiles at you," she whispered, "you are already his. Even in life, your soul begins to rot." Before I could respond, the candles flickered. The crypt grew colder. And then, from the shadows at the far end, I saw him. Father Gabriel. He stepped forward, silent, the corners of his lips curling upward in that dreadful, inevitable grin. My chest tightened, my knees buckled. For the first time, I understood what it felt like to have your very soul marked. Helena raised her crucifix, shouting prayers, her voice raw with defiance. But Gabriel only laughed, and with that laugh, the stones beneath our feet cracked, dust falling from the ceiling as though the earth itself answered his call. From below came a sound I will never forget, a gaping, wet, hungry noise, like 1,000 mouths opening at once. The crypt shook. The manuscript burst into flame, its ashes consumed before they could touch the ground. Gabriel smiled wider. "Now you see," he whispered. "It was never about me. It was always about what waits beneath." And in that moment I knew. Every funeral, every smile, every grave was not the end, but the beginning of something far worse. The mouth was waiting, and it was still hungry. Chapter 14. The Last Funeral. The village could take no more. After Isabel's burial alive, after the painting, after Sister Magdalena's disappearance, there was no faith left in us, only fear. But fear can turn to rage, and rage to defiance. And so, one night beneath the cracked bell tower, the elders gathered us in secret. "We will give him a funeral," they whispered. "The last funeral. And this time, the coffin will not open." It was madness, but it was all we had. The plan was simple. Lure Father Gabriel into a service of our making. Trick him into blessing a coffin prepared not for the dead, but for him. The blacksmith's apprentices forged iron nails thicker than thumbs. The farmers gathered chains blessed in stolen holy water. The women sewed shrouds not for grief, but for war. For once, the funeral would belong to us. The day came. At dusk, the bells tolled, 13 times as always. The villagers filed into the church, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, but their hands clenched with purpose. At the altar stood the coffin, larger, heavier, carved from oak so thick it seemed immovable. Upon its lid, in ash and salt, we scrawled a single word: silence. Father Gabriel entered, cassock trailing like shadow, his grin already wide as though he sensed the trap, but welcomed it. He approached the coffin, laid his hands upon it, and whispered words none of us could hear. That was our signal. The men rushed him, chains in hand. The women hurled salt into his eyes, chanting prayers twisted into curses. The children wailed, their voices rising like a hymn of defiance. We forced him down, his smile never faltering, even as blood ran from his lips. He did not fight, he allowed it. That was the worst part. We pressed him into the coffin, nailed it shut, every strike echoing like thunder in our bones. The wood groaned, the chains rattled, but the lid held. For the first time, the smile was hidden. The coffin was dragged to the cemetery, buried deeper than any grave before it. 20 men shoveled until their hands bled, covering him beneath earth and stone. And when the last clod of dirt fell, silence spread through the night. No knocks, no laughter, only silence. For the first time in years, the village dared to breathe. Some wept, others collapsed in exhausted prayer. We thought it was done, that the curse had ended. But as the sun rose, the bell tolled again, 13 times. We rushed to the church, hearts pounding, only to find the coffin still buried, the grave untouched. Yet from the altar, his voice drifted, soft, mocking, eternal. "You cannot bury a smile." And when we turned, every villager who had lifted a shovel, every hand that had struck a nail, was grinning, not with joy, not with relief, with his smile. The last funeral had not been his, it had been ours.
Chapter 15. The Smile That Never Fades. Epilogue. The village no longer exists. The houses are empty, their doors swinging in the wind. The windows gape like hollow eyes. The streets, once filled with laughter and market cries, are nothing but silence and dust. Yet when strangers pass through, they swear they feel watched. They swear they hear laughter echoing faintly in the rafters of the church that still stands at the center, rotting, broken, but never abandoned. And always, there are the smiles, carved into tree trunks, painted across the walls of homes long deserted, scratched into the gravestones by hands no longer alive. Every mark, every curve, is the same, his smile, burned into the bones of the village itself. I am the last one left. I do not know why he spared me. Perhaps to bear witness. Perhaps to carry his story. Perhaps because he knows the terror will rot me longer than death ever could. Each night, I hear the bells toll 13 times. Each night, I hear the knocks beneath the soil. And each night, when I close my eyes, I see him standing in the shadows, grinning as though he has already claimed me. I tried to flee once. I thought distance would save me. But no matter how far I went, no matter how many miles lay between me and that cursed church, I found it waiting. The same bell tower, the same graveyard, the same coffin that would not stay shut. And at its door, him. Him. Always smiling. I understand now. He is not bound to a place. He is bound to us. To the living. To the dying. To the grieving. Wherever death lingers, he follows. Wherever a coffin closes, his lips curl. He does not need a village, because the world itself is his parish, and we are all his congregation. Soon, I will die. I feel it in my bones. The weight of his gaze pressing harder each day. I have not seen my reflection in weeks. Mirrors no longer show me my face. They show me his, smiling back. So I write these words for you. Whoever finds them, burn them if you wish. Forget them if you can. But when you stand at a funeral, when the bells toll and the coffin lowers, do not look to the priest. Do not search his face for comfort. Because if he smiles at you, your soul is already his. And when the earth closes over you, when your loved ones weep above your grave, you will not rest. You will laugh with him in the dark. Forever. For the smile never fades.